We have talked about black carbon in the context of pollution, health, short-lived pollutants or greenhouse materials. Let's say black carbon is not always a gas that we can get rid of to achieve immediate impacts on global warming and co-benefits on health and so on. Here, it's a nice review article on the black carbon cycle and its role in the Earth system. It's a very nice long article with lots of very nice references, but I'm going to be brief as usual. Talks about terrestrial, riverine, oceanic, atmospheric black carbon components and their life cycles, reactions, etc. If you are interested in this in details, obviously you want to go and read the paper. Here, just to look at it briefly with the most salient points, black carbon is produced by incomplete combustion of biomass by wildfires and burning of fossil fuels. So fossil fuel consumption is not going down as fast as we would like, but wildfires are increasing, at least if not in number, then their intensity and area covered and so on. Black carbon is environmentally persistent over centuries to millennia, sequestering carbon in marine and terrestrial environments. However, its production, storage and dynamics, and therefore its role in the broader carbon cycling during global change, are poorly understood. So when we say residence time of centuries to millennia, we have to be careful. That's not in the atmosphere itself, it's much shorter, but in the system, in the Earth system, it's much longer, of course. It's not very reactive, so it can hang around for a long time. In this review, we discuss BC black carbon cycling across land to ocean continuum. Wildfires are the main source of BC, producing 128 plus minus 84 teragrams per year. So uncertainties are always high in these things because you're taking few data points and trying to estimate global burdens. Negative climate BC feedbacks could arise as wildfires increase with anthropogenic warming, producing more black carbon, which in turn will sequester carbon, but the magnitude of these effects are unknown. Most BC is stored in terrestrial systems, with some transported to the ocean via rivers and the atmosphere. However, the oceanic BC budget is not balanced, with known BC removal fluxes exceeding BC inputs. So we have incomplete data in space and time. We demonstrate these observed inconsistencies using a simple ocean box model which highlights key areas of future research, measurement of BC mineralization and export rates along the land to ocean continuum, and quantification of previously unexplored sources of oceanic BC are needed to close the global BC budget. Of course, black carbon is absorbing and is a very strong warming agent, and also gets dry deposited or wet deposited if it's carried on around by the atmospheric circulation. Just to read some upfront material, wildfires and fossil fuel combustion produce substantial amounts of charred pyrogenic fire originating organic materials, including black carbon. Globally, fires produce about 128 plus minus 84 teragrams black carbon per year, of which most is left behind in the landscape as part of the charcoal, ash and other charred plant residues. A smaller fraction, 2 to 11 teragram black carbon per year, is emitted to the atmosphere as soot. Fossil fuel burning emits an additional 5 to 13 teragram aerosol black carbon per year. Because these processes convert relatively labile biomass carbon to more environmentally persistent, more slowly cycling BC, they modify rates of turnover in the global carbon cycle as a whole. Omitting BC production from assessments of fire impacts on the carbon cycle leads to overestimation of the strength of positive feedbacks between climate change and wildfire emissions, because you tend to focus on greenhouse gases and other impacts, aerosols that are not necessarily black carbon. The precise definition of BC varies depending on discipline, but the BC term used in this review refers to the carbonaceous, polycondensed aromatic product greater than 60% organic carbon in all, and these are derived from incomplete combustion biomass and fossil fuels. Since first described in 1985, BC is part of an incomplete combustion continuum consisting mainly of polycyclic aromatic structures of high molecular diversity, whose size, configuration, and functionality is driven by formation temperature, heating duration, oxygen availability, and fuel material, etc. So let's jump ahead and look at some numbers for dissolved black carbon, dissolved organic carbon DOC and DBC, and particulate organic carbon, which of course is a deadly thing that will make you sick if you breathe that stuff. And power plants, coal burning, etc., are always a part of this problem. In the environment, BC persists on timescales of centuries to millennia. The stability and longevity is related to its condensed aromatic chemical structure. So it's resistant to microbial decomposition. It's not a hydrocarbon that bacteria can eat. The reactivity of BC is further constrained by ecosystem properties, including microbial populations, enzyme kinetics, environmental conditions, and matrix protection. You can read the references to see exactly what we mean. As a result, BC is the oldest and most abundant molecularly characterized component of the modern carbon cycle. Looking at some definitions, black carbon itself is a carbonaceous condensed aromatic product we already mentioned. It's derived from incomplete combustion, as we said. Labile means compounds that experience rapid turnover within hours to days of release and do not accumulate, so they are able to be broken down, react with other things, and so on. Environmentally persistent compounds that resist microbial degradation accumulating on land and in the ocean for centuries to millennia are called environmentally persistent. Dissolved black carbon fraction measured within dissolved organic carbon. These are all filter-based estimates. Dissolved organic carbon, so as opposed to black carbon, organic carbon dissolved in water that passes through a filter, usually with a pore size of 0.1 to 0.7 micrometers. Particulate black carbon is a black carbon fraction in solid environmental matrices such as particulate organic carbon, soils, and sediments. Particulate organic carbon, on the other hand, is organic carbon suspended in water that is retained on a filter, usually with pore size of 0.1 to 0.7. So if they are captured by the filter, you call them particulate. If they pass through and you have an estimate based on concentrations, etc., you call them dissolved, right? Particulate versus dissolved. The key points just up front: black carbon is produced from incomplete combustion and can persist for centuries to millennia. Black carbon production is expected to increase with increasing fire activity under anthropogenic warming and could act as a negative feedback to climate change because it can have overall cooling effect. We'll see the feedbacks in a minute. Black carbon is often divided into particulate and dissolved black carbon, which can have different environmental transport mechanisms, residence times, and ultimate phase. The largest BC pool is in the soil, 160 to 200 petagram carbon globally. Of course, averaged estimate that will have a high uncertainty. Reverse transport 43 plus minus 15 teragrams black carbon per year. And BC is also recycled in other land aquatic systems, but the global relevance of these processes remains unknown. Oceans store 12 to 14 petagram of dissolved black carbon. The observed age of this BC is 4,800 plus minus 620 C14 years in the surface ocean, greater than 20,000 C14 years in the deep ocean. If you don't know what C14 is, please look up other podcasts, which is basically a naturally occurring isotope of carbon that is radioactive, so it decomposes into C13, C12, etc., or back to nitrogen, sorry. So nitrogen is bombarded by cosmic rays and knocks off proton and makes a neutron to convert nitrogen into carbon, and so on and so forth. And it has a life cycle of, I think, 5,750 half time that you can look up, 50 years, 50 years, okay? Future research must further explore the possibility that some of the dissolved black carbon in marine waters is not derived from terrestrial fires. So it's possible, is it possible that it's getting generated somehow? So jumping to figures, I'm skipping lots of text. The black carbon characteristics: pyrogenic material like char, charcoal and soot. That's a combustion continuum based on the fire intensity, temperatures, that's related to intensity, how long it lasts and so on. We can produce biochar or charcoal or soot. And plant structures: none, few, abundant in terms of combustion continuum for soot, charcoal and char. So formation and mobilization here: charring temperature 150 degrees, pyrolysis of 450 degrees for charcoal, and 800 degrees to 1000 degrees is the range of formation and mobilization. Solubility in water is low for soot, medium for charcoal and high for char. Molecular structure: non-aromatic dehydrated sugar is char, condensed aromatic functionalized polyaromatic hydrocarbon for charcoal, and graphitic crystalline and amorphous for soot. And this all forms BC with a size continuum and a carbon component, which is total organic carbon with dissolved organic carbon, dissolved black carbon, particulate black carbon and organic carbon. So here you can see size fractions. POC is here and DOC is here. Chemical classes, if you are interested in that: truly dissolved, colloidal, molecular macromolecules and nanomaterials, and solids. Obviously I'm not a good chemist. I do enough to survive in the climate business, but you know what these are if you're a chemist. If not, please look them up. I'm not going to go into the details here. Okay, climate carbon cycle feedbacks involving fire. The focus here is very much on carbon and not other sources of partial combustion of fossil fuels. So principal drivers of climate change include anthropogenic emissions from fossil fuels and land use change, which in this context, increased concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is the result, which obviously has impact on climate change, which in turn increases forest fires, which then can emit 70 to 90% of biomass carbon. That increases disturbance of vegetation and soil carbon, which then has a positive climate fire carbon cycle feedback of around 6 ppm CO2 per degree of warming. We always want to know per degree of warming what are the loops producing. So 6% is the estimate, 6 ppm of CO2 is the estimate per degree of warming. There will be uncertainties in that, but you also have the other loop going from increasing forest fires to increasing black carbon production with residence times of 1000 to 4000 years, millennia. Increased storage of BC in soils, which feedbacks which reduces CO2 in the atmosphere, kind of a crude carbon capture, not the best way to do it, but 5 to 30% of the biomass is converted to black carbon in this effect. And of course less CO2 in the atmosphere has a cooling effect, so it's a negative feedback. But increased storage of BC in soils also increases delivery of BC to the ocean via rivers, because it gets deposited into rivers and gets transported. So increased storage of BC in the oceans with residence times of 6000 to 23,000 years. So the range is large because there are uncertainties, and that also feeds back to reducing CO2 in the atmosphere and have a negative feedback on climate change. Is this a good thing? Obviously this is a horrible thing, and we have to see which one dominates, going this way, and this one is a negative feedback, but we wouldn't want to do it this way anyway, as I said. Okay, so in the terrestrial system, gigatons of particulate black carbon per year. You have various rivers mentioned: Amazon, Congo, Mackenzie, Padma, Ganga. So you can see that Amazon is got massive loading in terms of flux in gigagrams of particulate black carbon per year, and then the others drop off. But there are other issues with other rivers anyway. So this scales here are black carbon in terms of delta C14 parts per thousand. You can go and translate that into what depleted black carbon means. Depleted in C14 obviously means what does it mean? You have to be careful because the organic matter is depleted compared to the atmosphere, because black carbon is assimilated during photosynthesis and it begins to decay. So compared to the atmospheric concentrations, which remain approximately the same, organic matter will be depleted. So black carbon shows the source of biogenic carbon, right? So you have various numbers. I won't go into it. The reddish numbers are most depleted. So Mackenzie, Mississippi here. This is Hwangi and Brahmaputra, and Ganges has much lower numbers. Sorry, even positive numbers in terms of. So that's going to be organic matter, black carbon, as opposed to black carbon coming from biogenic sources that's been somehow introduced as well. So here I'm being very brief, but you can go and read about the sources. They have a lot of uncertainties as well, but nonetheless this is a phenomenal compilation, meta-analysis of published data. 3.8 dissolved black carbon teragrams per year in this latitude band 60 to 90 north, 1.4 dBc teragrams carbon per year in the 30 to 60 band, and 3.7 dBc teragram in the per year in 0 to 30 north, and southern hemisphere is somehow got much higher concentration, but is dominated by at the Amazon, 8.7 dBc teragram carbon per year in the 0 to 30 south. That's quite large, almost double what we are getting in the 60 to 90 north, and of course the Southern Ocean region has a small contribution as a whole. Okay, measuring BC, the use of consistent scientific language and methods to describe black carbon and fire-derived pyrogenic carbon generally promotes efficient communication within and among disciplines, so standards are maintained. It's also important to clearly articulate the specific methodological techniques and associated analytical windows used to assess BC, since we said in the beginning that definition is not always unique, as these have biases and artifacts that should be considered in the comparison and interpretation of the results. So atmospheric sciences, aerosol BC is quantified using optical approaches, even satellites are used for that, aerosol optical depth, etc. And they detect particles with highly absorptive properties that are characteristic of BC. And soil science, BC is usually measured using excuse me, benzenopolycarboxylic acid molecular markers. I won't go into the details, but you can read it up. In oceanography community, two methodologies have emerged for the determination of BC. The first approach involves chemothermal oxidation of bulk organic materials to reductively eliminate chemically reactive organic compounds, leaving behind a BC residue that is then quantified via elemental analysis. And that method is suitable for some purposes, and for open ocean applications, the benzene, why did I say benzeno? It's benzene polycarboxylic acid. I'm not a chemist, as I said. Molecular marker approach is most often applied for molecular level determination of dissolved black carbon. Okay, so radiocarbon delta C14 and stable carbon delta C13 isotopic analysis of chemothermal BC residues and BC derived benzene polycarboxylic acids have enabled unprecedented insights into potential sources that environmental residence times of BC in the and environmental residence times of BC in the Earth system. Okay, looking at the global dynamics of black carbon cycle, which is the main material for the review. So black carbon for biomass burning, so wildfires, black carbon converted to charcoal. It's not necessarily released from old charcoal. Black carbon from fossil fuel combustion, so those are the sources, goes into soil organic carbon, 13% black carbon, so 10 petagrams carbon, out of which fluxes are 100 teragram carbon per year with pool size of 10 teragram. No, that's further down, 10 teragram carbon per year. So those are fluxes. Okay, standing pool here 500 petagram carbon. Okay, riverine fluxes, riverine POC and DOC, particulate and dissolved organic carbon, oceanic POC with particulate black carbon in it, and sinking POC, so part of the solubility pump or maybe even biological pump, sinking particulate black carbon. And oceanic DOC is of course a huge pool. You can look at the circles, but if you look at the total carbon cycle, you will get a very different distribution of fluxes and pools, because of course there is a huge reservoir of carbon in the ocean, right? Most of it is there, and residence times are longer. Looking at black carbon from so same thing as before here, you are looking at riverine dissolved black carbon and riverine particulate black carbon increasing along the way, both of them, resulting in surface dissolved black carbon and sinking black carbon with deep DBC pool, which is accumulating because of the long residence times. So you have going from modern to ancient pools in terms of delta C14 ages or delta C14 concentrations in parts per thousand versus ages. So above you have ages of thousands of years, as we said, going up to 50,000 years, and depletion of C14 goes up to as high as minus 1,000 parts per thousand. They all have information on how we are accumulating various sources, black carbon from various sources. Okay, black carbon and ocean carbon, organic carbon stocks and fluxes. I won't read the numbers, but pools and processes. Production of BC, as we said, production of BC as aerosols, production of BC as aerosol through fossil fuel combustion versus biomass burning, atmospheric deposition, riverine PBC and DBC, leaching DBC from soils to rivers just because of the hydrologic processes, biodegradation at river-ocean interfaces. Basically, biology is taking out some of it and converting it into other forms of carbon or leaching it out. Marine sinking PBC that we talked about. So you can see radiocarbon dates. So fossil fuel 88.5%, biomass 131 plus minus 52%, so mean biomass age of 20 years, here 400 years, and this is 200 years. Okay, so few examples of the rivers are given here: Yangtze, Yellow River, and Pearl River. I guess they're just sticking to whatever data is available. Percentage of black carbon content of organic carbon, value of black carbon fluxes in teragrams per year or stocks in petagrams, various numbers, and these are the references from where these numbers are compiled. Okay, similarly, transport to hadal zones, loss by primary aerosol formation, so that's carbon hanging around in the atmosphere with a shorter life cycle. Ultraviolet loss, so just deformation by photolysis, coastal sedimentation, pre-aged hydrothermal fluxes from DBC and DOC, and pools in terrestrial soils, oceanic DBC and oceanic sediments. So variable surface age can go from modern timescales to millennia. Variable surface DBC age average 4,500 years, but large uncertainty of 1,200 years. In the deep ocean, you have 23,000 years with the uncertainty of 300 years. So ocean does keep a lot of things because of the circulation, thermohaline circulation, and so on. Just gets hidden away from the atmosphere. Oceanic sediments can be 6,000 to 24,000 years of residence times with various numbers on the fluxes and the pools, teragrams. Okay. Finally, BC processes across the Earth system. So key processes. Soil carbon here being produced, as charcoal, char, and other processes. Is there a reburning of soil black carbon when there is high intensity fire? Black carbon, of course, released into the atmosphere, and within hill slope decomposition, there are question mark, and water and wind erosion of and microbial loss in the soils themselves, freshwater sediments and pools in inland water bodies, intermediate reservoirs in incorporating into the soil. So atmospheric transport and aging happens, can be wet and dry deposition as we mentioned, or long-term transports based on whether there is a lot of precipitation along the way or not. So atmospheric BC with deposition. Riverine BC, there will be mineralization, priming for other reactions, flocculation, another chemical process that you can look up in terms of how it gets removed from the black carbon pool. Groundwater transport, we don't know at all. Deposition within the hydrological system. So petroleum and hydrothermal sources exist as well. So loss by primary aerosol formation in terms of marine black carbon, bubble plumes, ultraviolet oxidation, uncertainties there. Sorption to sinking particles, so it may just get glommed onto the surfaces and sink out, and there may be sediment resuspension at the bottom at the benthic pelagic interfaces, right? Assessment of the level of BC process understanding required for incorporation into models. So a review of the data-based information, meta-analysis of papers, etc. And it's argued that this is an important part of the global carbon cycle, which we are not including. But if you wanted to include it into models, you need the information, the knowledge, process understanding, rates, etc. to be at certain robust confidence levels. So these are pointing out some of those. Assessment of the level of BC process understanding required for incorporation into models. Atmosphere, soil BC, rivers, underground waters, riverine fluxes of DBC, riverine fluxes of PBC, aquatic continuum, models, freshwater sediments, oceans, oceanic DBC, oceanic PBC, ocean sediments, and models. So why am I jumping around? Because I'm not going to read all of them. Just as an example, in the atmosphere processes, we need to understand better water-soluble aromatic carbon deposition onto the ocean surface, which is, huge. So we need good data. Loss of BC through injecting primary aerosol formation. In soils, you need storage in soils, microbial loss, biotic transformation, abiotic transformation, movement within and from the soils, and key knowledge or research effort needed then quantifying BC present at water-soluble aromatic carbon, quantifying removal pathway at the surface ocean for DBC, quantify and model landscape and larger scales. For rivers, you need description, quantification, and modeling. So it's at a very primitive scale, even though it plays a role. Characterize chemical composition of BC post-fire, in situ mechanistic studies, regional studies, etc. So you get the idea that we know it's very important. We know it needs to be modeled. But generally in global ocean modeling, you want to build BC into a more complex and spatially resolved ocean biogeochemistry model with water mass circulation, and verify that data produced from different methods is comparable, correlate BC concentrations and remote sensing measurements, which is only good for the surface level, and so on. So long way to go, but nonetheless it's important that this review step is very important to understand that they must go into the models, so we must improve all these process understandings and data. Summary and future perspectives, I won't read too much. In summary, BC is environmentally persistent and represents a mechanism for long-term carbon sequestration over centuries to millennia. It's interesting that even though it's we are so worried about wildfires, this is actually thinking of it as a carbon sequestration process. It's clear that rivers transport substantial amounts of BC from wildfires to the ocean ultimately. Most of the BC on Earth is stored in the ocean sediments. However, There are outstanding gaps in our understanding of BC cycling. For example, residence times of BC in soils are poorly constrained and vary considerably across studies. This is actually true for soil carbon in general, even the amount. We know that we are depleting soil carbon, which has massive impact on soil moisture content, persistence, crop yields, nutrient uptake, all sorts of things. Likewise, the modeled ocean BC concentrations versus observation-based age profiles do not agree on the basis of the current expected sources and sinks of marine DBC. Reconciliation of BC budgets is essential for a comprehensive understanding of the global BC budget and also to support Earth system modeling of the BC cycle and to enable quantitative assessments of the negative feedback to climate change. Future research should target a refined framework for understanding the chemical identity of BC, improved measurement of BC decomposition across all the pools of the Earth system, particularly in soils, floodplains, and inland water bodies, and improved identification and quantification of BC sources to the ocean. Okay, so some major open questions go along the lines of chemical identity of BC. I won't read the details. Rates across the Earth system. These are always tricky because when you model, there are always rates involved, conversions, transports, losses, and conversion by various processes, which are of course sources and sinks, but it's very difficult to measure them in the field, and when you measure them in the lab, they don't necessarily correspond to the real world situation. Anyway, increased observations of decomposition rates and transport flows are required to constrain rates of transformation and turnover, and therefore the global black carbon budget in Earth system models. You get the idea. Okay, and rate across, oops, did I repeat it? Yeah, I did, for whatever reason. I screwed up. It happens sometimes, but anyway, you get the idea. Immediate research is required to quantify the role of intermediate reservoirs and coastal areas in transforming the black carbon. And we also don't know much about DBC sources in the ocean. The lack of explanation for aged dissolved black carbon in the ocean highlights the uncertainty around its source, fate, and cycling in the marine environments. Rivers are the main source of marine BC, but there is an incomplete understanding of the composition, concentration, and timing of material export out of the watersheds immediately in the short term, let's say hours to few years following a burn event. So there is direct deposition from the atmosphere, and rivers are bringing in a lot, but rivers are near the coasts. How much of it gets out into the open ocean, and how far, how much it sinks out or gets converted and leached out, and so on. So given the complex nature of BC production and timing of subsequent transport to the deposition sites, charcoal calibration studies are essential for relating sedimentary charcoal records to regional fire activity. Thus, modern data coupled with calibrated sedimentary records will enable the community to model and predict future fire hydrology interactions better. Okay, people haven't thought much about fire hydrology interactions, but it's an interesting point. So this is a bit long, but it's a nice review article, and I didn't want to split it, and I'm obviously being very, very brief. So please follow up if you are interested. Okay, see you in the next topic.